Timothy Edward Travels was a man of means. You must understand that growing up in a very wealthy family meant one never had to do without. Anything Timothy needed, anything he wanted, he simply asked and it was his. Sometimes he did not even have to ask. He was used to everything falling into his lap. As a kid, his parents used to tell him that he was the luckiest little boy in the whole world, and he believed them. He succeeded in everything that he did, and therefore he truly believed that he had more luck than anyone. When Timothy turned 20, he decided he was old enough to leave home and he wanted to travel. He felt he was born to do it. After all, he was born into a family with the name Travels. He had plenty of money to do it and nothing tying him down. It was his best chance to see every part of the world possible, and he wanted to try out all forms of travel: plane, train, automobile, boat, maybe even spend enough money to fly in a space shuttle up to the International Space Station. Timothy was well known in the city, not only as being part of one of the wealthiest families, but also because word of his planned grand adventure had spread like wildfire. He had set a date for his departure, and his family put together a big celebration to see him off. People from all over came to witness the event and to give Timothy gifts for good luck. Gifts seemed silly. He didn't need any more luck. He was maxed out. But he certainly was not going to turn away gifts. Even if he had more than any person could ever need or want, he could never resist a gift. The day for his departure came, and a big celebration ensued, which consisted of a feast and a lot of joyous entertainment. A big crowd of people was there. Many familiar faces and many not so familiar ones. A plane was parked nearby and ready to fly him to his first destination. Even he had no idea where he would go first, but he figured flying would be best for his first journey. As the party drew to a close, it was time to give Timothy his parting gifts so he could be on his way. A lot of people brought him simple gift baskets filled with snacks and treats and things to eat along the way. After all, he would be gone for a seemingly long time, and no one wanted him to go hungry. Of course, he would never go hungry, but you can't blame the common folk for being of a simpler mindset than Timothy and his wealthy family. Among the other gifts were maps and books, and even some interesting varieties of clothing. Timothy was bored of these gifts, as they mostly seemed useless and impractical to him. But even though he was a spoiled little rich kid, he was brought up to be polite to guests, and therefore he did not let his inward disdain of these people and their pointless gifts show. Instead, he was grateful and thanked each person. He let them all know how happy he was that they came to celebrate the start of his grand adventure, and he wished them all happy days to come. He said goodbye to his parents, and as he was about to board his plane, one more gift-bearing guest managed to make his way up through the crowd. It was a frail old man that looked to be around the age of 80. Timothy was taken aback by the sudden appearance of this man and wondered why he wasn't in line with the rest of the guests earlier. The old man explained that due to his age it was difficult to stand in a line for such a long time, so he wanted to wait until the line was over. He also apologized that it took him a while to walk up there, again due to his old age and the frailty of his body. Timothy was actually quite disgusted at this. He didn't see any reason for a nasty old geezer to come to this lavish party and to have the nerve to come up to him as he was boarding his plane. Frail, old, or not, Timothy was not having it. He had bottled up his disdain long enough, and he felt like he could not be polite any longer. As he was about to open his mouth to give this geezer a good yelling, the old man handed Timothy his gift. It was a small package, but it was so beautifully wrapped that it looked almost as if Timothy's mother wrapped it herself. As usual, when he saw a gift, his expression changed. Timothy stopped himself from yelling at the old man and instead shot him a quick, nasty glance before snatching the gift from his hands. The old man told him that he hoped the gift would help him find happiness. In that instant, Timothy forgot about the anger and instead burst with laughter. He was the happiest person he knew. This journey wasn't about finding happiness. It was because he was the luckiest person in the world, and he could do whatever he wanted. And what he wanted was to travel the world, plain and simple. He didn't need any more happiness because he already had it all. Timothy opened the gift and saw it appeared to be an antique compass. He knew this thing had to be a few decades old at least. but surprisingly, it looked to be in good shape, and it seemed to be much heavier than any compass he'd ever felt before. Nevertheless, it fit his luxurious style, so he did not complain. Instead, he just shoved it in his pocket, gave the old man a quick and not-so-sincere thank you, bid his parents another farewell, and boarded his plane. Before taking off, the pilots asked Timothy where he wanted to go first. He thought about it for a moment, and then told them he wanted to see the North and South Poles before seeing anything else. They started up the plane, and off they went. Timothy had the whole cabin to himself. It was filled with all of his gifts, not just from the commoners, but also from his parents. Being so exhausted from the party, Timothy decided to sit down and kick back, hoping to take a bit of a nap. When he sat down, he felt something heavy in his pocket and realized it was that compass from the old man. He took it out of his pocket and decided to look it over some more. He noticed that it really was a nice compass. Part of him actually felt bad for feeling so angry towards the old man now that he held this nice gift in his hands. Then he started to wonder where the old man got this. He wondered if it was stolen or if it was a precious family heirloom that the old man decided to part with for some unknown reason. It seemed to be in working order because he could see the needle of the compass whirring around as the plane turned and set its course in the sky. He turned the compass over and noticed there was an inscription on the back. We move forward with the hope of looking back. We look back with the hope of moving forward. He thought about that for a minute and wondered if he read that in a book somewhere. It seemed like a passage from a well-known story. He tried to figure out if it was a riddle or had some deeper meaning. It confused him, which was frustrating because he was usually good at riddles. Then he moved his thumb and realized there was a carving right below the inscription that simply read, "Time Travels." Then he understood. It was indeed a quote or riddle of some sort, and it was about time travel. But he was too stupid to get it on his own. Whoever owned this before him was smart enough to understand, which made him think of the frail old geezer hobbling up to the plane. This really enraged him. It was a new sensation because he was supposed to be the lucky one who succeeded at everything. He should have understood the meaning. He should have figured out the riddle before reading the carving. The words echoed in his mind. We move forward with the hope of looking back. Now that he knew this was about time travel, it was obvious that sentence was referring to the obsession with traveling to the past. We look back with the hope of moving forward. This one was harder to understand. He wasn't sure how this sentence related to time travel. We look back with the hope of moving forward. His first thought was looking into the past in order to travel into the future. But then he realized that didn't make much sense. He grew more and more frustrated by the minute. He was so frustrated that he threw the antique compass onto the floor. It hit with a loud thud and a crack. His eyes popped open in shock, as he didn't think he threw it that hard. One of the pilots yelled from the cockpit, asking if everything was all right. He told them it was fine and that he had just dropped something. Then he got up and picked up the compass. The needle was spinning out of control until it just vanished before his eyes. He thought maybe it was spinning so fast that he couldn't see it anymore, but no, the needle was gone. Just then, the plane started to experience some turbulence. The pilots told him to buckle up. He got in his seat and fastened the seat belt. He looked out the window and saw dark storm clouds all around them, filled with lightning and intense rain. Then he saw a bright light coming from the compass still in his hands. It started to fill the cabin until all he could see was brightness, as if he was staring at the sun. Timothy closed his eyes and then felt as though his body was a hunk of metal being pulled toward a giant magnet. He heard a whoosh that sounded as if something had zoomed past him in the air. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer on his plane, but instead, he was outside standing on the ground. He looked down at his hands and saw that he was still clutching the compass. To his astonishment, the needle was right back where it should be. When he looked up at his surroundings, he saw things he had never seen before. His grand adventure had truly begun, only he was not at the North or the South Pole. He was in the future. He just didn't know it yet. Chapter 2. He had no idea what to think. Timothy was in such a shock that he assumed he was just dreaming. He remembered going through some turbulence, so he thought maybe the plane crashed and he was in a coma, or even worse, dead. But he found it odd that he still had that compass in his hand, and odder still that the needle was there when, in fact, he had watched it vanish just moments ago. He had to figure out where he was. First thing he noticed were some people walking around in what appeared to be some sort of a city park. Only it wasn't quite like parks he was used to. The trees weren't just trees. They were part metal, and they had lights in them. The people walking around had sunglasses on and wore nothing but silver robes. He looked up and noticed that there were a lot of planes flying overhead, and they were quite low to the ground. When he looked closer, he realized they actually weren't planes at all. They were buses. Flying buses. Metal light trees, sunglasses, silver robes, flying buses. This was all too much for Timothy to handle. With compass in hand, he took off running. He had no idea where he was or where he was going, but he knew he had to get away from that place. Eventually, he made his way to what appeared to be a downtown area of whatever city he was in. The buildings were all infused with so much technology he couldn't tell where the original architecture stopped and where the electronics began. In fact, he wasn't sure if these buildings had any architecture he was used to. He couldn't tell if anything was made of stone or brick, as it all looked like it was metal and circuitry. It was at that point that he wondered if he somehow shrunk down and was inside of a computer. Finally, he noticed some people walking around who weren't wearing silver robes, but they still had sunglasses on. These people seemed to be wearing standard clothing, although it still seemed like something he'd never seen before. He ran up to a group of these people and frantically asked them where he was. They stared at him for a moment and then looked at each other and laughed. He was irritated. They started to walk off, and he shouted back at them, asking again where he was. Rather than turning around, one of them simply raised their arm and pointed a finger up to the sky. Confused, Timothy looked up to where they pointed, but it was so bright he couldn't see anything except for what appeared to be silhouettes of flying buses. As someone walked by, he snatched their sunglasses right off their face, put them on, and looked up. The person shouted in anger, but Timothy couldn't hear them. In that moment, he felt like he was going to be sick. He gave them their sunglasses back, hunched over, and ralphed right on the sidewalk. He heard a zoom overhead and saw a black orb hovering in front of him, positioning itself right over the mess he made on the sidewalk. With a zap, the mess was gone and the orb flew off. While that was astonishing to see, Timothy couldn't stop thinking about what he just saw in the sky with the sunglasses. He saw the name of his city scrawled across the sky in what appeared to be some sort of permanent lighting, as if to let everyone know where they were. He found it odd, and he didn't understand how it was possible, but he knew one thing: this was not his city. Not really. Something was going on, and he needed to get to the bottom of it. He wasn't sure where to even begin. This place had the same name as his city, but it looked absolutely nothing like it. His home definitely did not have metal light trees, people with silver robes, sunglasses everywhere, black orbs cleaning vomit off the sidewalks, flying buses, buildings that looked like enlarged components of a computer motherboard, and above all else, his home did not have the name of the city permanently fixed in the sky with lights. He tried to look at the sky without sunglasses again, but could still only see silhouettes of buses. He put a hand up to his forehead to try and shield his eyes from the brightness, but it was no use. Someone running along the sidewalk bumped into him, and he dropped his compass. Timothy shouted at the person for neglecting to watch where they were going, but then noticed the compass roll away from him. It rolled on its side until it bumped into a curb and toppled face down. He walked over to get it, and as he reached down to pick it up, he stared at the inscription again. this time not so much focused on the quote, but instead focused on what was carved right below it. Time travels. That word stayed, frozen, at the front of his mind. Timothy always wanted to travel the world, and had just set out on a journey to do so. He was going to have all sorts of travels: air travels, sea travels, ground travels, but he never thought about having time travels. No, time travel was not real. He knew it wasn't real, so why would he ever think about it? Then he looked around again. So much advanced technology, people dressed funny, a place claiming to be his home, but yet he didn't recognize it. At that moment, he thought the impossible. He time traveled. He really did. He wasn't sure how it was possible or how he even did it, but he knew that he time traveled and that he had to be in the future. That was the only logical explanation for what was going on. To think that time traveling into the future was the only logical explanation for anything made Timothy feel like he was going to Ralph again. It was absurd, but it had to be true. What appeared to be a solid glass bench was nearby, and he collapsed onto it. He had to breathe and consider everything that was going through his mind. Once the panic and confusion wore off, he started to feel amazement and wonder. He was in the future. Not many people got to say that. His mind went back to what he always thought, that he was the luckiest person in the whole world. He got to travel into the future. This would be the ultimate adventure. Timothy no longer cared about traveling the globe. All he had to do was travel down the block, and he would see and experience more than anyone else from his time, and that was good enough for him. However, it wasn't long before reality set in. Timothy was stranded. Yes, he was in a special place that he was so excited to explore, but he was also in a foreign place, in a sense. He was in the future, and for that matter, he had no idea how far in the future he was. And the worst realization swept over Timothy. He didn't have any money. How was he going to eat? Where was he going to sleep? How could he have this adventure and experience the wonders of the future without having any money? He had to think of something, and he had to think of something fast. Timothy was completely averse to the thought of asking someone for money to be able to eat. He detested beggars and did not want to be seen as one of them. Instead, he decided to scour as much of the city as he could, hoping to find some form of money lying around. Of course, he had no idea what the money would even look like. By the time the sun went down, Timothy was still searching for money, but came up empty-handed. He was starving, and this was a bit of a new sensation for him, as he didn't really know what it was like to do without. He thought he might die. But then he spotted what appeared to be a restaurant, and made his way inside. The smell of the food was so delicious it nearly made him faint. He went up to the counter and asked for something to eat. He was desperate. In fact, he was so desperate that he didn't realize he was speaking to a machine rather than a human. The restaurant was entirely automated. He looked around and noticed that there were only 2 people inside, a couple having a quiet dinner to themselves in the corner. Once again, he asked the machine if he could have something to eat. The machine asked for payment first before he made his selection. Timothy's heart dropped. He told the machine that he didn't have payment. The machine insisted that everyone had payment, and that he needed to first initiate payment before he could place his order. He tried to explain to the machine again that he did not have payment. This time the machine was a bit more aggressive, and told him that if he refused to pay, he would be forced to vacate. Timothy looked around and saw the couple in the corner staring at him. Finally, he quietly asked the machine how he was supposed to pay without any money. The machine then let out what sounded like a laugh, a high-pitched, mechanical laugh. It sent a shiver down Timothy's spine. He had a feeling he was about to be kicked out, and he knew he'd die of starvation. Instead, the machine spoke again. It explained that money had not been used as payment for a century, and that words are payment. More specifically, spoken thoughts. It explained that you get one opportunity to offer a spoken thought as payment. The more profound the thought is, the more credit you get to spend on whatever you like. To initiate a payment, you must state, "My thought is this," and when you are finished speaking, it is quickly analyzed. Timothy asked it how long the thought had to be. The machine said that the most profound thoughts could be spoken in one word, and the dullest thoughts could be spoken in 1,000. Essentially, the length of the thought had no bearing. Timothy found this interesting. He didn't understand how on earth a society could function with no money, but rather on using words as payment. It was so bizarre to him. But if that was how it worked, then he knew he had to think of the best thing he could. He looked down at the compass he was still clutching after this horrible day and uttered the words required to initiate payment. The machine made a noise and signified it was listening and ready to receive his spoken thought. He turned the compass over and read the inscription on the back. We move forward with the hope of looking back. We look back with the hope of moving forward. After a few seconds of silence, the machine made another noise to signify payment was complete. It told him the thought was most profound and that he could enjoy anything on the menu that he desired. Tears welled up in his eyes as he thought he would end up starving to death. He made his food selections and ate his fill. Now that he understood the payment system, he felt ready to find a hotel, as he needed to rest up before a big day full of adventure. As he was about to leave, the couple that had been staring at him from the corner approached him. They accused him of cheating the system. He was confused and a bit upset since he didn't understand what they were talking about. They told him that your spoken thoughts can't be read from material, they have to be genuine. The couple wanted to know how he did it. One of them told the other that they saw him reading from an object in his hand. They saw the compass sitting on the table and lunged for it. Timothy tried to stop them from grabbing it, but it was too late. They already had a hold of it and made their way up to the machine. The man spoke the words to initiate a payment, and the machine buzzed, saying he had already offered a spoken thought during this visit. He groaned and tossed the compass to the woman. She spoke the words to initiate a payment, and then read the inscription on the back of the compass. The machine buzzed and said the thought was not authentic. She looked at the man, and they both turned to look at Timothy. They growled in disgust and threw the compass back at him. He caught it and put it safely away in his pocket, still confused by what had just happened. Then he thought once again how he really was the luckiest person in the whole world. He was starving, and those words saved him somehow. He crossed his fingers in hopes that they would be of use to him elsewhere. But if not, at least he knew how payments worked. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. Timothy spent a great deal of time exploring and learning all about this future version of his home. He also learned that he initially traveled 100 years into the future. That explained why things were so drastically different. Some days he felt himself missing home and his parents. Yet other days he reminded himself that he was the luckiest person alive to be able to experience this fantastic voyage. He traveled a little outside the city and noticed that most places were essentially the same. Flying buses, city names scrawled in permanent lighting in the sky, black orbs zooming around, cleaning up the streets and sidewalks, and automation, thanks to the machines. It became clear to him why there was no money system anymore. Since everything was automated, there was basically no workforce anymore, other than a select few that helped maintain the machines. These people were compensated with an unlimited credit chip. They didn't have to worry about spoken thoughts because they had credit wherever they went. The machines replaced everyone else, which meant no one needed to get paid. But people still needed a way to purchase things, and since the workforce was essentially wiped out, rather than risk an intellectual recession, they put the spoken thought payment system in place to encourage everyone to maintain and increase their knowledge. for if they had dull thoughts, they would not be able to purchase much at all. In some ways it was genius, but in other ways it was brutal. Luckily for Timothy, his compass got him through everything. He still didn't understand how, but that inscription on the back paid his way for everything he needed. 100 years in the future, and his parents' words still rang true. He was the luckiest little boy in the whole world. One thing Timothy noticed over the course of his months spent in the future was how much he started to change. He began to see things a bit differently than he used to. After that first day where, according to Timothy, he nearly starved to death, his eyes were opened. He realized that some people actually have to live with worries and scares such as that on a daily basis. He couldn't fathom that, and he didn't want to fathom that. He chose not to. But recognizing the existence of such a problem was progress. After a few more months of exploring all kinds of things that the future held, Timothy decided it was time to return home. He was anxious to see his parents again and to tell them about his grand adventure. They wouldn't believe him at first, but he had plenty of stories to share, so they would believe him eventually. He pulled the compass out of his pocket and saw the needle whirring around as he walked. He stopped and held the compass up close and told it he was ready to return home. After closing his eyes, he expected to see that blinding light and feel that magnetic feeling, but nothing happened. He opened his eyes again and repeated his words to the compass, promptly shaking it a bit. Still nothing. Panic slowly started to rise from deep within his guts. Timothy realized that he had actually never thought about how he would get home. Since the compass brought him here, he assumed that it would take him back. He assumed all he had to do was just tell it to take him home, and it would. He was confused. He was scared. He was worried. Why wasn't it working? At this point, he was shouting at the compass to take him home. Some people walking by stared at him as they passed. Suddenly, he remembered that just before he time-traveled here, he had thrown the compass onto the floor inside the plane. This prompted him to throw the compass hard on the ground. It bounced slightly with a loud thud, but nothing happened. He had never been more scared in his life. All these months he was enjoying himself and thinking he was on this grand adventure in the future, and now he realized that he was stuck in the future. He wouldn't believe it. He was the luckiest person in the whole world. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. He knew he was going to make it back home, and he knew exactly how to prove it. He went straight to the city library to pull up news archives. Since he was from one of the city's wealthiest families, he was famous here and had to be recorded in history somewhere. His grand adventure was talked about for so long, and there was a massive party, so something had to be in here. He accessed the archives and searched his name. What he found instantly filled him with horror. The most read article tied to his name. Mr. Travels' travels cut short. Parents heartbroken. Timothy was shaking as he began to read the article. The night of Timothy Travels' great celebration will be remembered for a long time to come. The party was filled with a great feast, spectacular entertainment, a multitude of guests, lavish gifts, and of course the luxurious Travels family themselves. It was all in celebration of the grand adventure Timothy Travels had planned. He was going to see the whole world and experience everything. Unfortunately, shortly after taking off, Timothy Travels' private plane was struck by a violent storm. The pilots of the plane spoke with Timothy about buckling up due to turbulence. As the storm grew more violent, they knew they had no other choice but to try and land her on the first patch of solid ground they spotted. As they were making their descent, something critical happened with the plane's electrical components, and next thing they knew, the entire system seemed to be shorting out. They made the immediate decision to go for parachutes and make the jump. When they went to the cabin to get Timothy, he was nowhere to be found. The pilots shouted back and forth at each other as they tried searching every possible place on the plane for him. Unfortunately, they could not locate him. Even more unfortunate was that they spent their precious remaining moments searching for Timothy and trying to save him. They ran out of time to be able to jump to safety. The plane crashed into the ground, and both pilots were killed upon impact. Their heroics were recorded and retrieved from the black box pulled from the wreckage. Our hearts go out to the families of the pilots. We know they sacrificed themselves in order to try and save Timothy's life. And our hearts go out to Mr. and Mrs. Travels, who are incredibly heartbroken at the loss of their dear son. No one knows if he somehow got out of the plane, or if he was simply hiding and out of sight of the pilots. But one thing we do know. Timothy Travels dreamed of adventure, and that adventure was cut short. May he find peace and happiness wherever he is now. Timothy wept. He felt his insides crumble with despair. He couldn't believe what he just read. He never made it home. But surely his future wasn't set in stone. He could still find a way to make it. Then he looked down at the article again and caught a glimpse of one line. And our hearts go out to Mr. and Mrs. Travels, who are incredibly heartbroken at the loss of their dear son. The tears welled up in his eyes again. All he could think about was the pain his parents must have felt, having to live the rest of their lives, not knowing if he made it off the plane or if he was dead among the rubble. He was right here. If only he could tell them. More than anything, he wanted to tell them he was all right. He'd never felt such pain and misery before in his life. He realized he would never see them again, and felt so stupid for wanting to go on this dumb journey in the first place. He threw his whole life away. He had everything he ever wanted. He was wealthy, loved his parents, succeeded at everything, and because he just had to travel the world, he was stuck in the future, never to return home. And there was no point to even try. Timothy left the library very sullen and defeated. He didn't know where to go or what to do, but he knew he was never going back to his time. He was stuck here, and he had to learn to deal with it. He decided to go find his family's mansion and wondered if it would even still be there. Since he had no brothers or sisters, he wasn't sure what the city would have done to it after his parents passed away. It turned out the Travels property was fairly untouched. It wasn't overrun with technology like practically every other part of the city. He learned that his parents modified their will in case Timothy ever returned. They put a clause in that stated the city was to never touch their land unless given permission by Timothy himself. This ensured that if Timothy was alive and ever returned, everything would still be his. And if he never returned, then the place would simply wither and die as time passed, untouched by anyone else. After visiting the ruins that he once called home, he felt a little better, but still depressed that he'd never see his parents again. He decided the right thing to do would be to fix it up a bit so that he could live there by himself, unbothered by the rest of the city. If he couldn't travel back to his home in his time, then he would have to make the most of his home in this time. He found one of the black orbs that cleaned up various parts of the city, but wasn't sure if they worked like the other machines he'd interacted with. He decided to speak to it and asked if it could follow him to clean up a mess that he found. It stopped in its tracks and then seemed to follow along beside Timothy. Once at the gate, a voice came from the orb and said it was not allowed to touch the property without the proper authority. Timothy explained that he was the proper authority, and that he gave his permission. The orb was silent, and then appeared to scan Timothy. After several seconds, it dinged and said that it would be happy to comply. Timothy asked if it could gather up several other orbs to help speed along the process. It whizzed off and returned with a dozen black orbs. Within an hour, the place was looking quite livable, inside and out. He was pretty impressed. He thanked the orb, but before it zoomed away, he told it that he no longer authorized it to touch the property. The orb made a sound of acknowledgement and then went on its way. Timothy made his way inside his old home. He looked around at the emptiness of this once-filled home. He decided this was the best thing for him. Chapter 3. Timothy's daily routine consisted of roughly the same thing. He woke up, ate breakfast, painted all day, then ate dinner and went to bed. If it weren't for the few machines he acquired for the mansion, he would have starved years ago. The only thing that calmed his constant rage was painting. His parents always tried to get him to paint as a kid. He never enjoyed it, though. He was good at it, just as he was everything else, but it bored him. Who knew one day it would be the only thing he ever wanted to do? It reminded him of them. He painted every day to honor their memory. Before going to bed each night, he would hold that compass in his hands and just stare at it, as a reminder of the curse that brought him to this place, the curse that stole him from his family, the curse that eventually made him realize he was not the luckiest man in the whole world. One day while painting, he decided to paint that dreaded compass. As he painted it, he realized it was a bad idea. Instead of calming him, it enraged him. Halfway through the painting, he threw all of his paint at the canvas and tore through it. He shouted as loudly as he could. Enough was enough. It was time to get rid of that cursed thing. He grabbed the compass from his room and took it downstairs. Then he grabbed a hammer to smash it. He placed the compass on a table and was about to swing the hammer. Just then, the inscription that he hadn't thought of in years appeared in his mind. We move forward with the hope of looking back. We look back with the hope of moving forward. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, and it confused him. Hope. But he wasn't sure why. He threw down the hammer, grabbed the compass, and held it close to his face as if it were a living thing. Then he screamed at it, asking what it was and what it wanted. Exhausted from his rage, he collapsed into the nearest chair and let out a few sobs. Timothy looked at the compass again, wondering how long it had actually been since that day. He asked one of the machines how long they'd been there. When they answered him, he realized it had been about 10 years since he arrived. He couldn't believe it, but he decided it was way past time to find out what this compass truly was. Surely, in a future where so much technology dominated the world, someone could figure out what was up with this compass. After he cleaned up and dressed, he finally left the home for the first time in a decade. He noticed some small changes around the place. Nothing too grand, just more technology, more lights. The black orbs that used to zoom about cleaning the area were much sleeker and quicker. The city name in the sky looked a bit neater, but still odd nonetheless. Other than typical things that come and go with decades, such as hair and fashion changes, not much else was drastically different. He caught a glimpse of a silver blur out of the corner of his eye, but by the time he turned to look, it was gone. Timothy went to the place he usually went to get any information, the city library. Once inside, he asked the machine with whom he could speak to about technology. The machine said he could speak to it about anything technological. He asked it to examine the compass in his hand. The machine scanned it and said it had nothing to report. It was a compass. That wasn't quite the response he expected. He explained that the compass was a time machine. The machine let out a high-pitched mechanical laugh that sent a shiver down his spine. It assured him that it was just a compass and that no such technology existed. Feeling defeated again, Timothy left the library. He shook it off and assured himself this would not get him down. He was lucky. He was the luckiest person alive. If someone could help him figure out what the deal was with this compass, he would find them. He decided to ask the first person he passed. So he did. She looked at the compass, made a comment about the inscription being cool, but offered nothing else. Timothy explained that he felt like there was something really weird going on with it. Then he looked around, hushed his voice, and said that he believed this compass was the key to unlocking the mysteries of science. Her eyes widened, and she stared at the compass again. Then she stared at Timothy. She told him he should probably check with the Platts. He gave her an odd look and asked what the Platts were. The woman explained the Platts were a group of people who gave up maintaining the machines in order to try and solve issues and invent new technology. Apparently, they were afraid that humans were relying on the machines too much and therefore would not be able to control the future or something like that. Timothy thought about this. Then he asked her why they were called Platts. She said that wasn't their actual name, but she couldn't remember the real one. Platts was what most people referred to them as because they only wore platinum robes, and it just rolled off the tongue. He let out a noise that startled the woman so much she let out a bit of a scream. He thought of the silver blur he just saw earlier. That must have been a Platt. Then he remembered. His mind raced back to that very first day and this time. One of the first things he saw was a group of people wearing silver robes. Silver and platinum were so similar that it made no difference. They were definitely Platts, and they were right there in front of him. He snapped back to reality and asked the woman where to find them. She said they usually lurked about, gathering data from all over the place. But they spent most of their time near the lumen wood. That was the name for the metal light trees that Timothy also saw when he first arrived. He couldn't believe it. It was like a few puzzle pieces were coming together right in his mind, and he could hear the pieces snapping together. He was so elated that he gave the woman a hug, thanked her, and headed off in the direction of that familiar place. It was time to return to the place where he first arrived. It was time to see the lumen wood again and meet the Platts. When Timothy reached the spot where he first arrived, he saw the lumen wood but didn't see any Platts. He decided to sit down on one of the glass benches and wait until he saw one. After waiting for what felt like hours, he was about to doze off when he saw it. A flash of silver. He sprung to his feet and saw them. A group of 3 Platts moving from one tree to the next, checking something near the bottom of them. He went up to one of them, and the man looked taken aback. The Platt removed his sunglasses and asked Timothy what he needed, as he was incredibly busy. Timothy explained that he had this strange compass and he wanted them to look at it. The Platt scoffed and told him that he was far too busy to scan knickknacks. He put his sunglasses back on and started examining trees again, trying to shoo Timothy away. But Timothy decided to lay it all on the line. If these people were interested in new technology, then surely they'd be interested in something that could cause time travel. He told the man that he was from the distant past. He said that he accidentally traveled here and believed this compass had something to do with it. The man slowly rose up, removed his sunglasses, and examined Timothy with caution. He then looked at the compass that Timothy was holding. The Platt told him that he had his attention, but only for the sake of personal interest. Of course, he did not believe that he was from the past, but he was interested to hear what Timothy had to say. He told him to follow along to their base, and they would discuss it further. They didn't have to travel too far. Timothy saw they were headed towards a metal hatch in the ground at the center of the park, surrounded by the lumen wood. The Platt pressed a button on the side of his sunglasses and then held his palm over the hatch. It lit up and then vanished. The Platt walked right over the now gaping hole and dropped right in. Timothy looked down and saw him waving up at him to follow along. He walked over the hole and dropped in as well, landing softly below on what felt like a huge marshmallow. The Platt pushed a button on the wall, and Timothy heard a snap up above. He looked up and saw the hole was covered again. Once inside, they sat down, and Timothy explained his story to the Platt. He told him about how he was planning to go on a big adventure and was given a lot of gifts, one of which being that mysterious compass. Then he explained how he was on the plane and threw the compass on the floor before seeing the bright light and feeling that magnetic pull that brought him here. The man thought something about his story sounded familiar, but he wasn't sure what it was. He asked to look at the compass himself and commented on how heavy it was for an ordinary compass. When he noticed the inscription on the back, he raised his eyebrows. He mentioned that it was very curious indeed. Timothy was becoming a bit impatient and mentioned that someone on the street told him the Platts could help. This made the man wince. He scowled at Timothy and told him not to call them Platts. He said they prefer to be called Crons. Personally, Timothy thought Platts sounded better than Crons. He explained that they were really a group of scientists who were fascinated with the idea of time travel. They spent years maintaining the machines and realized the world was slowly losing its humanity by becoming more autonomous. The world was relying so much on the machines to do everything that eventually this would be the machines' world, and the humans would only be here if they allowed it. So they formed this group to pool their knowledge of technology and science together to try and invent time travel. If successful, they could go back and prevent this massive machine outbreak. Honestly, Timothy wasn't entirely interested in their plans and their goals. He just wanted to get home. But now he understood why the guy wanted to hear more about his story. Timothy told him that he wasn't there to help them with their cause. He was there to see if they could help him get back home. The man looked at him and told him that he still wasn't entirely sure Timothy was actually from the distant past. He thought maybe it was just another trick that people liked to play on the Krons from time to time. Timothy told him his name and that he needed to get home. The man's eyes seemed to grow 5 times their original size. Suddenly, he realized why the story sounded vaguely familiar. He took out a device from a nearby drawer and held it up to Timothy, seemingly scanning him. Then he gasped and looked him up and down. Timothy asked what was going on. He said that he just ran a bioscan on him and confirmed that he was, indeed, Timothy Travels. He couldn't believe his eyes. The man shook Timothy's hand and properly introduced himself as Philip. He explained that everything the Krons did wouldn't have been possible without the Travels family. Timothy didn't understand. Philip told him that Mr. and Mrs. Travels invested a vast majority of their wealth into science and technology after Timothy's accident. They wanted to ensure that things would be researched and invented in order to prevent such tragedies from ever happening again. It wasn't long before the first machines were invented, and from there it was an exponential growth of technology, a surge, a boom. The machines became more and more prominent in society until they reached the point they were at now. Philip smiled and said he felt like the luckiest person in the world that he was standing here talking to Timothy. This made Timothy chuckle. Timothy pondered the fact that his parents were essentially the ones who caused the creation of the machines, but realized it was really his fault for leaving in the first place. Once again, he told Philip that he was sorry, but he had no interest in helping their cause. He only wanted to go back home. Philip laughed and told Timothy that was just it. He said by going home, Timothy was perfectly helping their cause, in a much better way than they could have imagined. It was Timothy's accident that caused his parents to invest so much into science and technology. By sending him back to his proper time, they wouldn't be overcome with so much grief, and therefore would have no need to make such a huge investment. Because of that, science and technology could progress at a natural pace. If the machines were to ever be invented, they would be invented in their own due time, and the technological boom wouldn't occur as it did. Things would be changed. Timothy understood now and decided they were sort of on the same page. Philip told him that they'd actually been working on a piece of technology they believed was close to achieving time travel. He asked to examine the compass. Timothy handed it over, and Philip cracked it open. He fell silent and slowly pulled an odd piece of metal out of the compass. This must have been what made it heavier than normal. Timothy asked what it was. Philip said nothing. He walked over to his workstation and grabbed something. When he brought it back to Timothy, the thing he showed him looked identical to what he just pulled out of the compass, only his was newer. Philip explained that the device inside the compass appeared to be a finished model of the device the Krons had been working on. He was puzzled. Time travel could be tricky. Timothy told him about the old man who gave him the compass. Philip said he wasn't sure where the old man got this, who he was, or where he came from, but this was definitely the Krons' device. He believed that if he could study the finished version, then he could reverse engineer the tech and in turn finalize the version they'd been working on. It appeared this contained the missing information they had been searching for. After just a few short days, Philip got it. He explained to Timothy that he could still use his original compass as it was not broken. There was a delay function that was based on how far you traveled in time. The further you traveled, the longer you'd have to wait in between time jumps. Timothy asked him how long before he could make the next jump. Philip said that according to the readout on the device, the next jump would be in about 15 years. Timothy lost his breath. He couldn't wait another 15 years. He needed to go home now. Philip explained that time travel was dangerous, and that is why they implemented the delay. Since Timothy had already been in this time for 10 years, that meant the delay was a total of 25 years, a quarter of his initial 100-year jump. Timothy insisted on using the new device that the Krons just finished. After all, it was primed and ready for its first jump. Philip strongly advised against it due to the fact that they hadn't run any tests on it yet, or made any practice jumps. Timothy didn't care. He didn't have anything else to lose. At best, he would return home and see his parents. At worst, he would be right back to where he was, stranded. No loss. Timothy offered up his family's property and everything in the house as payment. He said the Krons could use that as their new base of operations. It would be better than hiding out underground. It was a most interesting proposal, and one that Philip couldn't turn down, so he put the new device inside Timothy's compass and kept the old one. Timothy had insisted upon keeping the compass, even though Philip said it wasn't necessary. He explained that the device simply needed contact to be made with it in order to work. Some sort of hard force to activate it. In Timothy's first case, throwing it on the floor of the plane activated it. Philip said that it didn't have to be a hard force, just a simple smack of the device would do. But the important thing was to be sure you kept it held tight in your hands once activated. The technology in the device reads your thoughts and emotions, then determines the jump based off them. Therefore, you must be thinking of precisely where you want to go when you activate it. It seemed simple enough, and also made sense as to why Timothy was brought here. The only thing on his mind 10 years ago in the plane was that he wanted an adventure no one else ever had. And this place had certainly shown him adventure. He thanked Philip and made his way out of the base, back up to the Lumenwood. He felt like he should leave from the same spot that he arrived in. Philip followed him. He told him to remember that this hadn't been tested, and therefore he couldn't guarantee that it would take him where he wanted. Timothy smiled and assured Philip that he was the luckiest man in the whole world. He was going to see his parents again, and everything here would be fixed. Then, Timothy did something that surprised himself. He gave Philip a hug, and told him he'd never forget what he did for him. Philip smiled a nervous smile and stepped back. Timothy smacked the compass, and it made a loud cracking noise before emitting a bright light. The needle spun out of control until it vanished entirely. He held the compass close to his chest. Dark storm clouds appeared overhead, and it began to rain and lightning, the same as when he was on the plane. But he didn't care. As he held the compass close, Timothy closed his eyes tight and thought of his parents, his family, his home. All he felt was love and longing to be with them again. He knew he was lucky, and he was going to thank them for instilling all that luck in him. At that moment, he felt as if he was a huge chunk of metal, being attracted to a giant magnet. There was a whooshing sound overhead, then silence. He opened his eyes. Chapter 4. He looked around. This appeared to be his city, although he'd just spent 10 years in a future version, so at this point he couldn't really be sure. He didn't see any Lumenwood. The trees appeared to be just plain old trees. No metal, no lights. He didn't see people wearing silver robes or funny clothing. The clothing wasn't quite what he was used to, but then again, he was never too keen on the commoner's style, so he never paid too much attention. The important thing was, he didn't see anyone wearing sunglasses, and he didn't see any flying buses. No black orbs zooming about. He looked up at the sky. Nope, no city name scrawled up there. Yes, he had to be home. This was it. Someone was sitting on a nearby bench reading a newspaper, so he walked up to them to ask what day it was. But as he got closer, he saw the front page of the paper. Travels family heir born. Meet baby Edward. Timothy's heart lurched. He snatched the paper out of the person's hands and skimmed the front of it. He overshot. Went too far back. His dad was just born. He was 50 years too early. How? Why? Why was this happening to him? All he wanted to do was get back to his family. Was that too much to ask? Philip did warn him that it might not work properly. But then again, it did work. It sent him back to his family. He was in his city, and his dad was here, along with his grandparents whom he'd never met. But this wasn't what he had in mind. Maybe he thought too hard about it. Maybe that's why he went so far back. Who knows? He wasn't a scientist, and he couldn't exactly ask Philip about it either, as he wouldn't be born for over a century. And unfortunately, Timothy had no way to get an accurate reading from the device to see when the next jump would be. But if it was typically a quarter of the jump distance, then he could calculate it pretty easily. He needed to travel 110 years to the past, but overshot by 50 years. Meaning he jumped 160 years, so a quarter of that was 40 years. He would have to wait 40 years before he could jump again. He was 30, and he wouldn't be able to jump again until he was 70. That was it. His life was over. It was time to face the fact that he was never going home. Timothy didn't want to bother going to his family's mansion. He didn't know his grandparents, and they would think he was some stranger anyway. And it's not like he'd be able to see his newly born father. Maybe it was best if he just left this city altogether. Maybe it was time to leave it all behind and accept that he wasn't the luckiest person in the world after all. Timothy took one look at the city and then walked away. He was headed for the train station, where he planned to hop on a train and go as far as he could in one trip. Wherever he stopped was where he would start his new life. Once he got to the train station, he realized, of course, that he didn't have any money. Spoken thoughts wouldn't do him any good there. He needed good old-fashioned cash. And his pockets were empty, save for his compass. He found a bench. Not a solid glass bench, but an old wooden bench. Feeling pathetic, he plopped down onto it. He couldn't even escape the misery because he had no money. Timothy watched as people clambered out of the train that just arrived and were greeted by their loved ones. He wanted so much to see his family, to be welcomed back from his trip with open arms just as these people were. But that would never happen for him. He curled up on the bench and decided to try to sleep his problems away. In doing so, he felt like a common bum. Essentially, he was one. He had no money, he had no job, and he was homeless. So here he was, reduced to this. As his mind wandered, he started to give in to the notion that he would either have to ask someone for money or eventually starve to death. Years ago, he would have rather died than be a beggar. Part of him still felt like it would be better to die right now and get it over with. But no. He made it this far and suffered this long. He truly wanted to start over. And the only way to do that would be to suck it up and ask someone for money. The worst that could happen is someone would say no, and he'd be in the same boat as he was now. Timothy wanted to try and take a rest first, hoping that maybe this was just a bad dream. If this was all still here when he woke up, then he would go ask someone for money to ride the train out of here. Before he fell asleep, someone approached him and said he looked like he needed help. They laid a bit of spare change next to him on the bench and told him that they hoped he had a better day. He looked at them, and with tears in his eyes, he thanked them. It was just enough money to get a one-way train ticket and even a small bite to eat on board. When the train pulled into its destination, Timothy got off and made his way into this new place that he would grow to call home. He wasn't sure what he would do there, but he felt hope, and it felt good. One of the first things he saw as he began to explore the city was a want ad for a local painter to help spruce up the city hall. Timothy smiled. A few years went by, and Timothy made his new life in his new city. He was a painter, and a good one. Good enough to make a steady living. He sold paintings to local museums and art galleries, and he was even commissioned to paint things for the city from time to time, because they loved what he did with the city hall. A lot of people enjoyed his work because they felt it portrayed a style of wonder and forward thinking. They felt as if he were painting the future itself. Little did they know, he essentially was. He painted things he remembered: machines, lumen wood, technological landscapes. Some days he wondered if he had dreamed everything, and maybe he was really born in this time. Maybe Timothy Travels didn't exist. But no, he existed all right. In fact, he decided it best to change his name in this new life of his, so as to not raise any questions. He was now Timothy Terry, which to him seemed like a fitting name since he no longer traveled and was essentially stuck in one place. One day, he was asked to attend a reception at the local art gallery to celebrate his latest work and to speak on the importance of art in modern culture. He was not fond of public speaking, so he was not looking forward to it. But he did see it as an honor to not only have his art celebrated, but to possibly inspire future artists. Timothy figured this was a good way to honor his parents. He attended the reception, and the speech was excellent. Afterwards, he was approached by several people, thanking him for his words and complimenting his art. He kindly thanked them back. When the majority of people were gone, he noticed a woman lingering about in the gallery, transfixed on one of his paintings. In particular, it was a painting of a tree that looked to be infused with metal and had lights coming out of it. Timothy approached the woman and said that the lumen wood were some of the most beautiful things he'd ever seen, especially at night. When she turned to look at who had spoken to her, Timothy realized he was mistaken. This woman's beauty outshone any image of lumen wood in his mind. In fact, she had to be the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. She asked him a question, but he didn't hear her. He felt as if time itself stopped, and all that existed was her beauty. Then he snapped back to reality and flushed with embarrassment, realizing how ridiculous he must look just staring at her like a weirdo. He apologized, and she smiled, then asked how he came up with the idea of the painting. He shrugged and told her that he had dreams of those trees, and when he woke up, he painted them before he forgot. She laughed and looked at the painting some more. Then she let out a small gasp and turned to him and apologized. She forgot to introduce herself. She told him her name was Victoria and that she was a local teacher. He told her he was Timothy Terry, a local painter. She laughed and said she knew who he was because of all his paintings. She said she always called him Tim for short because Tim Terry sounded funny and it made her laugh. This made Timothy laugh as well. He couldn't remember the last time he laughed and smiled as much as he had these past few minutes. Over the next few weeks, Timothy and Victoria saw more of each other. They began to become more acquainted and familiar with one another. She appeared at all of his art gallery receptions, and he, in turn, would take her out to dinner afterwards. He would talk about his paintings and the inspiration behind them, and she would talk about the silly things that went on in her classroom that day. Eventually, they started up a relationship, and it was beautiful. Timothy had never seen happiness like this before, and he was under the impression that Victoria hadn't either. One evening after dinner, they decided to take a walk in the park. It was a pretty night, and the sky was clear. They found an empty spot in the middle of a group of trees, set down a blanket, and laid down to look up at the stars. Timothy couldn't help but think of the future. He thought of the time he looked up at the sky and saw the city name scrawled up there. How bizarre that was. All the trees surrounding them reminded him a bit of the lumen wood. He described that for Victoria. He told her to look around at the trees that encompassed them, to close her eyes, and try to imagine the trees had some strips of metal running up and down them, connecting to a small metal door near the bottom. He told her this wasn't an ugly, rusty kind of metal, but a shiny, splendorous metal, and when the light hit it, it made the tree shine. He then told her to imagine the branches themselves emitted their own glow, almost as if they had their own light that they wanted to give to the world. Some branches offered different colors than others, and their colors blended together in such a harmony that it was like seeing the most beautiful melody you've ever heard. He told her that was the lumen wood. That's what he saw. That's what he painted. Victoria smiled and opened her eyes. She looked at him in amazement and wondered how he could come up with such a beautiful thought. She asked him to tell her more about how he became such a talented artist. When they first started getting to know each other, he had mentioned that he started painting because it calmed him, but she was so amazed right now that she wanted to know more. He panicked. They hadn't talked much about their pasts yet. Not really. The idea made Timothy nervous, as he wasn't sure what he would tell her. He knew there was no way she'd believe he was from the future. Who would believe a story like that? When the time was right, he would tell her. But for now, he would tell her just what she asked, how he became an artist. He told her that he actually came from a very wealthy family and that he was an only child. This made her raise her eyebrows. She didn't expect to hear that he came from means. He mentioned that from an early age his parents always wanted him to paint, but he never enjoyed it. Even though he seemed to have a natural talent for it, it bored him, so he never pursued it. But later on in life, when he was older, he found something calming about painting. So he picked it back up, and the rest was history. Timothy looked at Victoria, and she was looking at him like she could tell there was more to the story. Her face crinkled, and she looked down. She asked him about his parents. His heart dropped to his feet. He was afraid she was going to ask that, and he wasn't ready to talk about them yet. But he supposed he probably should at some point. After all, he felt like he could tell her anything. He was not ready to mention the whole time travel bit, but he could tell her about his parents. Filling in some of the gaps from his story, he told her that when he was 20, he decided to take a trip because he always wanted to see the world. He pulled his compass out of his pocket, held it up, and said that was what began his grand adventure, the thing he'd always wanted to do. She looked at the compass as he held it up and complimented on how elegant it looked. He put it back in his pocket and said that as he was about to start his journey, tragedy struck. He told her that he never got to travel the world, but instead, he learned that he would never get to see his parents again. It caused him to be upset for so long, depressed, enraged, pretty much everything but happy. And he let those emotions rule his life for a while. He told her it was during that time that he picked up painting, which he did as a way of remembering them, since they always wanted him to do it. And then he found that it calmed him. He told her that eventually he decided to leave home and start a new life in a new place. That's when he journeyed here and found this city, used his talents to fix up the city hall. Next thing he knew, he was being honored at art gallery receptions and taking a pretty girl out to dinner. He flashed a quick smile and then looked down at the ground. Victoria put her hand on his cheek and looked at him after noticing he had tears in his eyes. She knew he missed his parents deeply. He missed his home. She told him that there's no real explanation for why we go through the tragedies we go through in life, and in turn, there's no explanation for why we go through the joys we go through. It has nothing to do with luck. Everyone has good times, and everyone has bad times. She told him that the moments are what matter, and the people in them. Even though he experienced a tragedy that cost him his parents, she said he has to think about the times he had with them. all the precious moments they shared together, and the love they had for each other. Those moments would be with him forever, and no tragedy could take them away from him. Timothy felt as though his whole world turned upside down. The emotions he was feeling were too strong to form into words, but he knew one thing. This woman in front of him was the most beautiful and most intelligent person he had ever known, and he loved her. With tears in his eyes, he kissed her. "I love you, Victoria." She smiled and told him she loved him too. Then she kissed him. Chapter 5. They enjoyed each other's company so much that they couldn't stand to be apart for too long. After a few months, they were married. Timothy and Victoria Terry, also known as Tim and Tori to each other. She thought Tim Terry sounded funny, and he thought Tori Terry was even better. They made each other laugh every day. When it came to the subject of children, they both decided they wanted them, but found out neither could have them. They went through a dark period, a sad period. Timothy had never seen Victoria quite this sad before. She explained to him that she grew up with her mother. Her father died when she was a baby, so her mother raised her and her sister all on her own. She always admired her for that, and she'd always told herself that she wanted nothing more than to show that same motherly love and kindness to her own children one day. If she could be even half as good a mother as hers was, she felt she would make her proud. So the thought that she would never have the chance to be one broke her heart, and it broke Timothy's to see her that way. He held her hand and told her the same thing she told him before. There was no explanation for the bad things that happened to them, and even though they were going through a rough time, they were going through it together. They had each other, and they loved each other. No tragedy could ever take that away. They were strong, and they would make it through it. He told her to think back on all the things her mother taught her over the years, and to realize that she was, indeed, showing that motherly love and kindness to children. No, not her own, but because she became a teacher, there were countless children out there now who had been made better because of her and the things her mother taught her. He told her that he believed her mother would be very proud of her. Victoria threw her arms around her Tim and kissed him. Soon their spirits rose as they decided since they couldn't have children of their own, they could start up a school for the neighborhood kids. That way, together they could experience the joy of having children in their lives and also help mentor and shape the lives of these young ones. They lived in a small neighborhood outside of the city, and the nearest school was quite a distance away. This would make it easy for the neighborhood kids to get their education without having to travel very far. And the neighbors were all happy and enthusiastic about the idea. It was a great community, and they all trusted each other. After a few years, the school was booming. The neighborhood had grown, and the school had begun to expand. There were several teachers now, but Timothy and Victoria still ran things together. Victoria still taught some classes herself, and Timothy headed up the art class, of course. They were incredibly happy. One day, when Timothy was walking into the city to get some supplies for the school, they passed by a shop that had a familiar-looking item in the window. It was a brand-new compass, and it looked nearly identical to the one he received when he was 20. He was 45 now, so he had that compass for a long time. It was odd to see one that looked brand new, since his already looked pretty old when he got it. He popped inside the shop and asked about the compass. The clerk said it was a new model and that it was the perfect gift for anyone who loved such novelties. She also said that there was a special in which they would throw in a free engraving with the purchase, such as your initials. Timothy had an idea. He wanted to give this as a gift for his wife. When he showed her his compass a long time ago, she admired it. He decided to get her a matching one, so he asked the clerk if it was possible to have a message engraved on the back. The clerk was confused, as usually people only wanted initials, but she supposed she could make it work. Timothy told her he'd take the compass, and then he wrote down the message on a piece of paper and handed it to her. The clerk read it and shot him a puzzled look, then told him to come back tomorrow and it would be ready. When Timothy left the store, he noticed someone sitting on a bench across the street. The person looked really tired and really hungry. He pulled some spare change out of his pocket and gave it to the person, saying he hoped they had a better day. He smiled as he walked away, remembering the kind person that did the same for him all those years ago at the train station. Ever since he started having money of his own again, he always carried around spare change in his pocket for such occasions. He told himself that if he ever saw someone in need, he would give what he could spare. It felt awful to be in that position, and he hated to think that some people felt like that all the time. Being with Victoria made him realize that everyone was special. Everyone had good days and bad days, and if he could help someone have a good day, then that's what he wanted to do. Tomorrow came, and Timothy was excited. He couldn't wait to see the look on Victoria's face when she saw it. She never saw the inscription on his own compass, so he wanted to see if she could guess what it meant. When he went back to pick up the compass, he noticed it looked spot on, just like his compass, the only exception being there was no carving of time travels underneath the inscription. No answer to the riddle. He wanted to see if she could guess it on her own. Overcome with excitement, he practically skipped all the way home. People probably thought he was nuts. When he got home, he told Tori he had something for her. She asked what it was, and he told her to come sit down and close her eyes because it was a surprise. Intrigued, she came in and sat down, eyes closed tight. Timothy placed the wrapped compass into his wife's outstretched hands and told her to open her eyes. She looked at him confused and then opened the gift. When she saw the compass, she didn't know what to say. He told her to turn it over. She read the inscription. We move forward with the hope of looking back. We look back with the hope of moving forward. She looked back up at Timothy, who was grinning from ear to ear, and told him she didn't understand. He explained that it's sort of a riddle, or more like a quote. Well, it had to do with something, and she was supposed to figure it out. She said she didn't understand the meaning of the compass itself, the reason for the gift. Timothy laughed and told her that was easy to explain. He went and grabbed his old compass to show her, and she remembered it. He explained that because of that old compass of his, he found her. The compass was a gift for the start of the grand adventure he had planned to take. At the time, he thought he was the luckiest man in the world. When the tragedy struck with his parents, he thought he was cursed because of the compass. But then things turned around and he thought he was lucky again. And then things went horribly wrong again, and so naturally he thought he was cursed again. This compass had been with him through all kinds of ups and downs. Then one day he realized that, thanks to this compass, he met her. Her eyes were welling up with tears just as his were. He explained to her that he had never truly been happy in his life. But thanks to that crazy compass, he found the love of his life and his ultimate happiness. And he wanted to get her a replica of the compass so they could both have one, as a reminder of what led them to each other. Tori threw her arms around him and gave him a kiss. He told her he loved her, and she said she loved him too. After a few minutes of staring at the inscription on the back, Tori said that it made her think of time travel. Timothy smiled and shook his head. Of course she'd get it. Chapter 6. The years went by, and the school flourished. Timothy and Victoria no longer ran the school. They retired years ago. On the first day of their retirement, Victoria had a surprise for her Tim. She wanted to do something extra special for him since they were now at a point in their lives where it was possible. Timothy decided to sleep in a bit on his first day of freedom, so she used that as her opportunity to put the surprise into motion. For months, she had been planning to have a little trip for them. First, they were going to take the bus out to the docks, where a boat would be waiting for them. And from there, it would just be her and Timothy on the open sea, headed for anywhere. She knew he used to dream of traveling, so she thought now that they were retired it would be the perfect gift. and the best way to repay him for giving her such a beautiful life. She went to the bus station and hopped on the first bus of the morning, headed for the docks. Once there, she checked with the captain of the boat to make sure everything was still set for their departure later that day. She also had to get Timothy's gift ready. Yes, she had another gift for him. A book she found that would be essential for the trip. She wrapped it up nice and neat, and she found a good place in the cabin of the boat for it to reside until they arrived there later. When she got back home, Timothy was just getting up for the day and was making breakfast. They smiled at each other and talked about how odd it felt to be at a retired age. Timothy mentioned that he had ideas for some new paintings, but that these would just be for around the house. No art galleries and no city buildings, just home. He couldn't help but notice that Tori wouldn't stop smiling. So he gave up and asked her what was going on. She couldn't hold it in any longer and told him to go pack some clothes because they were going on a trip. He looked at her suspiciously and asked what kind of trip. Tori smiled and said it didn't matter what kind of trip. She told him to go pack some clothes and get cleaned up, because they needed to leave soon. He stared at her for a minute and then complied. They got on the bus and he still had no idea what was happening. When they got to the docks and he saw the boat they were headed towards, he asked her what kind of trip it was. She scoffed and told him to stop asking so many questions. There was something in the cabin of the boat that would help explain it, so she motioned for him to follow her. Once they got inside, she handed him the wrapped gift. He sat down and unwrapped it to find it was a book, and a thick book at that. But what struck a chord within him was the printing on the cover. The Book of Travels. Timothy stared at that cover for a long time. He hadn't thought of his old name in years. Did she know? She couldn't have known. He never mentioned it. It had never felt like the right time. He looked at her, and she was smiling from ear to ear. Bursting with anticipation, she asked him what he thought, and he asked her what it was. She said it's what it said it was, a book of travels. He opened it up and saw various maps of the world in it, along with points of interest for all sorts of places. There were also checklists and blank pages for recording your own information. He was a bit confused, but mainly because his mind was still thinking about his name and whether or not she knew something. Then she explained to him that they were going to travel, like he always wanted to do. Now that they were retired, they could do anything they wanted. And she knew he always wanted to travel the world when he was younger. Now they could do it together. He felt a tear run down his cheek, not only at this kind and thoughtful gesture from his dear Tori, but because he knew it was time to tell her the truth. This was a sign. She had to know. He kissed her and thanked her for the gift, but then told her he needed to confess something to her. This worried her a bit. He said that there were a few gaps in his past that he never filled in because he wasn't sure how to explain them, or if she would even believe him. Her eyes started to glaze over, as she didn't understand what he was getting at. He assured her that it was nothing bad, but it would probably be confusing. Starting from the beginning, he told her everything. His original family name, the bright light on the plane, the future with the machines and the lumen wood, how he exiled himself to his old abandoned home for 10 years in that future world, before finally attempting to leave. He also told her about Philip and the Crons, and about returning to the time when his father was a baby. Finally, he told her about riding the train to his new life that led him to meeting her. He pulled his compass out of his pocket, and she pulled her compass out as well. This compass had quite literally led him to her. She was in shock and didn't say anything for a few minutes, trying to wrap her head around the fact that her husband was originally from a different time. Then she smiled and said that a lot of his paintings made sense now. He was stunned and asked her if she believed him. Of course she believed him. She didn't care what time he was from. she wouldn't have cared if he was from the moon. He was her Tim, and she was his Tori, and all she cared about was the joy and happiness they brought each other, and the moments they shared together. After all these years, she still continued to amaze Timothy. He wished he had told her sooner. He apologized for it, but she understood why he did what he did. She told him he was silly for thinking she would think otherwise, but she understood. They embraced. The love and happiness Timothy felt in that moment was more than he could have ever asked for. They spent their years of retirement traveling the world, just as Timothy always wanted to do when he was younger. He had a feeling his string of amazing luck would run out eventually, which it did. Shortly before his 70th birthday, Timothy lost his wife to illness. They had a good life together, but he always thought they would have had a longer one. Victoria passed away in her sleep while clutching the compass that her dear Tim gave to her all those years ago. For a short time, he once again felt like he was cursed. But then he looked back over his years with Tori and realized that he was given the best life he could have ever asked for. He got to spend so many years with the most amazing person he'd ever met. He wasn't sure how he would continue on without her, but he knew that for her sake and her memory, he had to. Chapter 7. A year after Tori died, Timothy was having a hard time sleeping. He kept dreaming that he was back in that odd future world and stuck in a room with the machines. It had been decades since he thought of the machines. He tossed and turned, but the future world kept taunting him. Finally, he was awoken by a beeping noise coming from his nightstand. He looked over and saw a flashing light coming from his old compass. Then the light faded and the beeping stopped. This confused him. He was just having a crazy dream about the future, and now he saw his compass flashing and beeping. So he got up to examine it. It felt warm. He flipped it over and looked at the inscription and the carving. Both appeared to be normal, nothing out of the ordinary. Then it clicked in his mind. 40 years. Had it really been 40 years? The delay was over. The device was ready for the next time jump. But where would he go? He wasn't too far away from the original time he left from, the day he got on that plane. In fact, that was only about 10 years from now. He sat down and realized that in his old city, there was a boy living there right now by the name of Timothy Travels, a 10-year-old boy. He laughed to think that there were two of him now, and had been for some time. An old man and a little boy. A little spoiled brat who thought the world revolved around him, and that luck belonged to him. He had admitted that sometimes that little spoiled brat still broke through, but for the most part, he was a completely different man. Thanks to his traveling, thanks to his experiences, and especially thanks to his beloved Tori. His eyes welled up at the thought of his sweet wife. Instead of jumping 10 years from now to the time he originally left, he could jump back to when Tori was still alive. He could go see her again, spend another day with her. If he had that gift, he could do it. In fact, he was gonna do it. He was gonna go see his wife again. For the longest time, he wanted so much to go back to when he first left. But he made peace with that a long time ago. Since then, Tori was his life. Tori was his home. That's who he wanted to see and be with again. He loved his parents. He missed his parents. But technically, his parents were still alive. If he really wanted to, he could go right to his old city and see them. Sure, they wouldn't know who he was, but he could still see them. He couldn't see Tori. She was gone. He had to use this jump to see her. The only problem was that he didn't know when he would see her or how far he'd go. But he knew that he had to calm himself, for if he thought too hard, he might go back to when she was a baby. just as he did with his father. He grabbed her compass for good luck and put it in his pocket. Then he grabbed his compass and held it firmly in his hands, looking at the inscription on the back. I am Terry no more. Mr. Travels is back. Honey, your Tim is coming to you. Tim Travels is on his way. As the words left his mouth, his eyes fell on the carving below the inscription. Time Travels. He froze. His mind was racing. It was as if his brain was piecing together a million puzzles at the same time. His knees buckled, and he lost all sense of the world around him. Feeling as if the air had left the room, he thought he was going to choke. He gasped for breath. That was not a word. That was not the answer to a riddle. It was a name. His name. Timothy Edward Travels. Tim E. Travels. Time Travels. Still staring at the words on the back of the compass, he fell onto his bed. He was confused, but at the same time, everything was starting to make sense. It was him. This whole time. The old man that gave him the compass as he boarded the plane. It was him. That's why the compass he bought for Tori looked like his compass. Because it was his compass. That's why he was able to use the inscription as payment in the future. The machines recognized the thought as genuine because it came from him. The reason the device inside the compass was identical to the design Philip and the Krons were working on was because it was that exact thing. He couldn't believe it. His whole life, everything he experienced, it all made so much sense now. But then the sadness hit him. He couldn't use the jump to see Tori. The device had to be taken out of his compass and put in hers to be given to his younger self. If he risked making the jump, there was no telling what could go wrong. He didn't even know how many jumps the device was actually capable of, but he couldn't risk it. If he didn't give the compass to his younger self, then he would never go on to experience everything and never go on to meet Victoria. No, he couldn't risk it. He wanted nothing more than to make the jump right then and see Tori, but it was more important that he ensured the future remained intact. Otherwise, he'd never meet her to begin with. He wanted his younger self to go on and experience everything he had. He had plenty of time to prepare to meet the 20-year-old Timothy Travels, as there were approximately 10 years to go until that famous party of his. Thankfully, he knew exactly when and where it would be. 10 years passed, and Timothy made his way back to his familiar city. He was finally back to his time. It took a while. He was an 80-year-old man now, frail and a bit weak, but he was here. He finally returned. It was the morning of the celebration of his grand adventure. He made his way to an old restaurant and took a seat at a cozy table in the corner, next to a window. While he ate his breakfast, he took in the view of his old city. When he finished eating, he pulled out a piece of paper and a pen, and he wrote a letter to his parents. Mother and Father, I realize this letter is not going to make much sense at all, but I can assure you that everything in it is true. It has been many years since I last saw you, but only a short time since you last saw me. I want you to know that I am fine. I am safe, and I am alive. In fact, I journeyed much farther than I ever imagined. So far, in fact, that I'm afraid I won't be coming back. I encountered some wonderful people along the way, and I even met the most amazing woman on the planet. Her name is Victoria. She is the best thing that has ever happened to me. It is like you used to tell me as a kid. I'm the luckiest boy in the whole world. She is everything. We are married now, and we are happy. You'll be surprised to know that I finally took up painting, just like you always wanted. I really enjoy it, and I'm good at it. I made a career out of it. I want you both to know how much you mean to me, and I want to thank you for everything you've ever done for me. I love you so much, and I'm sorry if this is confusing. I wish nothing more than to be able to be back with you again, but for reasons I can't explain, it's just not possible. But I wanted you to know that I'm the happiest I've ever been. One more thing. This is going to sound like an odd request, but you need to be sure to invest a lot of money in science and technology. If you believe in your heart that this is me, then please do that. Do it for me. Science and technology need you. I miss you both more than words can ever describe, and I love you with all of my heart. Your son, Timothy. With tears in his eyes, Timothy folded up the letter and put it in the envelope he brought with him. He sealed it up and wrote Travels on the front. Then he thought of Philip and how sorry he was that he had to cause that mess with the machines to happen. But if he didn't, then they'd never meet and he'd never get sent back. He had to make sure that everything happened the right way. Speaking of, he almost forgot the most important thing, the compass. He opened up his compass, and then he opened up Tori's compass. After carefully removing the device from inside his old compass, he placed it gently in the newer one. He then closed both compasses back up. It was weird feeling how light his compass felt. Now Tori's was the heavy one. He took the knife sitting on the table and grabbed Tori's compass. Then he carved his name on the back. Time Travels. There. Now it looked identical to his old compass. He gave it a kiss in remembrance of Tori and put them both in his pocket. Timothy headed off to the nearest gift shop to wrap it, because he knew it had to be special. He remembered the way his mother used to wrap his gifts as a kid, so he wrapped this compass the same way. Remembering back to the day he got the compass, he thought how uncanny it was that it looked the exact same. Time was so funny that way. After leaving the gift shop, he decided to walk around the city some more and soak in the familiarity. Timothy couldn't help but imagine little black orbs zooming all around, cleaning up the messes that he saw. As the light from the approaching sunset hit the nearby trees, he was reminded of the lumen wood. He figured that future world wasn't so bad after all. The night was creeping up, so he knew it was time to head over to his old property for the party. There was already a big crowd there, and he could see the plane parked in the distance. He found a table in the back and decided to sit there quietly and observe the surroundings. Occasionally, he caught a glimpse of his parents and even his 20-year-old self. That was bizarre. He had half a mind to give his younger self a smack for being such a twerp, but he knew that he wouldn't always be that way. He was going to have to go through a lot first. Timothy took his old compass out of his pocket and stared at the inscription. Finally, he understood the meaning. It wasn't as simple as just traveling into the past or traveling into the future. We move forward with the hope of looking back. He had to move through the future and then persevere through everything in the past in order to catch up to this time to see his parents and all things familiar again. This is the moment he tried to get back to for so long, and look at how far he had to move forward in order to reach it. We look back with the hope of moving forward. He now understood what this one meant as well. Now that he was here, looking back on this old life of his, he had hope of his own future. He knew that his younger self was about to experience the things that would lead him to Victoria and their life together, and now he would finally have closure on the whole ordeal. It took him a long time, but he understood it now. He was so deep in thought about the inscription that he nearly missed his chance to give the gift. He noticed the gift line came and went, and his younger self was about to board the plane, without the compass. As quickly as he could, he grabbed the gift and hobbled up there. The younger Timothy shot him a confused glance before asking why he wasn't there before. He apologized to him and decided, rather than tell him he was deep in thought and not paying attention, He would make up some excuse about not being able to stand up for long periods of time, because of his frailness, of course. He figured he better apologize for taking so long to walk up there as well. The younger Timothy's face changed into the most disgusted and contemptuous look. He could tell that he was about to open his mouth and explode with rage, so he decided the best way to prevent it was to show him the gift. As he expected, the younger Timothy's expression changed, and he snatched the gift from his hands. The older Timothy smiled and thought of how that compass was about to change his life. Looking at his younger self, he told him that he hoped the gift would help him find happiness. He knew this would go over really well. Just as he remembered, his younger self burst out laughing. The older Timothy watched with bated breath as his younger self opened the compass and then gave him a dull thank you for the present. Once his younger self boarded the plane, Timothy walked over to the families of the pilots. He shook the hands of both wives and gave them a thank you. They looked at each other a bit confused and then awkwardly smiled and nodded back at him. He told the pilots' children that they should be very proud to have such brave fathers. Then he smiled and headed off. Timothy walked toward his parents, his heart racing. He thanked them both for having this massive party and for allowing so many people to come. They, in turn, thanked him for being part of it and for giving such a nice gift to their son. He hugged both of them. They didn't quite expect that, but they thought it was a sincere gesture, so they accepted it. Afterwards, he pulled the letter out of his pocket and handed it to his mother. As he looked both of his parents in the eyes, they were both staring back into his. He told them to read it when hope was lost, and that they'd know when that would be. They kept their gaze on each other for a little while longer, and then he bid them farewell. They were still, motionless, holding the letter and watching him as he walked away. Timothy brushed away the tears from his eyes. When he returned home, the home he had made with Victoria, he sat down on his bed and pulled that compass out of his pocket. He realized that this was still his Tory's compass. After all this time, it was always the compass he originally gave her. He gave it a kiss. He looked down at the compass and said, "We've had quite the grand adventure, you and I." Timothy laid down and held the compass close to his chest. The only thing on his mind was Victoria, his sweet Victoria. He missed her so much. He had gone on far too long without her, and would give anything to be right there with her again. Then he started thinking about luck and how ridiculous he used to be. Just because something wouldn't go his way or wouldn't go the way he planned, he immediately thought he was cursed. But as soon as things went right, he went back to saying he was the luckiest. He knew that at some point in everyone's lives, they feel like the luckiest and the most cursed. No one person is born with all the luck. No one person is born with all the curse. You have good days. You have bad days. But it's the moments that matter, and the people in them. Despite all the crazy things that he experienced and all the things that went wrong, Timothy still believed he was the luckiest person in the world. But not because he succeeded in everything that he did, not because he was born into the wealthiest family, but because he met the most beautiful woman and he married her, and they had a wonderful life together. Timothy closed his eyes and thought of Victoria. The compass no longer had the device that made time jumping possible, but that didn't matter. Timothy was about to embark on another journey, to be with his Tory. He breathed his final breath, and then Timothy Edward Travels was at peace. The end.